Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us. So today we're going to talk about common issues that can impact the health of your magnetic media and their digital transfers. We'll start by going over preventative care methods for keeping your tapes as healthy as possible, and then give an overview of the anatomy and mechanics of a tape with regard to how it plays in a playback device. Then we'll talk about common symptoms and treatment options for damaged tapes. And finally, we'll wrap up with some promising new research to treat the dreaded sticky shed syndrome. The first and best way to fight analog ailments is to practice good preventative care, primarily with proper storage conditions. Ideally, your tapes should be stored at a low humidity and low temperature. But what is more important is that the environment remains consistent. You wouldn't want your tapes in an area where you can't control the temperature, like a garage or basement. To protect against water damage, it is a good idea to also keep your tapes elevated on shelves and to store them vertically in clean storage containers. And it's also best that they do not come into contact with magnets. Another vital piece of preventative care is keeping your machines clean. Chris recently took this video of XFR Collective member Samantha cleaning the inside of Metro's pneumatic deck. I clean this machine in between every transfer, and for this reason, I never keep the top of it screwed on so that I can take it off easily, and then I lift up that electronic board. So we use 99% alcohol on lint-free, static-free wipes and cotton swabs. The most important area to clean is the big circular drum, which is where the tape information is primarily read. And then there's also other parts where the audio is read. Any other area can be cleaned, particularly the areas where the tape moves through the machine. However, you want to avoid cleaning any rubber parts because this will cause them to become dry. And Chris, please feel free to hop in with any further comments or tips for cleaning your machine.
Maybe one last thing would just be that it is important to clean like lots of little things, even if you don't think that the tape is going to come in contact with those parts, because we'll talk about it a little bit later, but tapes can sort of start flaking apart. And so even parts that aren't in contact with the tape also need to be cleaned off because those flakes can get onto new tapes you put in. So yeah.
Okay. So another piece of preventative care that's more difficult is maintaining your machine. These are complicated devices that have mechanical and electronic components. These machines usually don't come with manuals, spare parts, or tech support. A lot of times we in XFR Collective come across these decks when they would just as easily be thrown away. It's a good idea if you have the space to keep non-working decks around for spare parts, but I would imagine it's a super complicated process to fully Frankenstein one together, not something that I would ever try. There are still vendors who can service and maintain these machines, but as the years go by, it gets more difficult to get these services at a price that the average person can afford. So that's one reason why it's very important to transfer your tapes sooner rather than later. That being said, do feel empowered to take off the lid and see how it works, see what moves when you put a tape in. Certain things like rubber belts are possible to replace. John Fazio, who works with Metro, replaced the belts in the pneumatic you saw on the previous slide. Chris, do you have anything to add about deck maintenance?
If you have some old machines that don't work, you can hold on to them. A lot of the time, vendors will do trade because they love getting old machines that don't work because they take them apart for other projects in the future.
Okay, so now that your deck is clean and in proper working condition, you always want to inspect the tape before you put it in a playback device. See if there are any broken pieces on the cassette. Peek in those windows to see if the tape is properly attached to the cassette. And of course, you'll want to make sure that there is no mold growing on the tape. It's best to never even try to play a tape with mold. You run the risk of contaminating your machine and causing the mold to advance to other tape. When you find mold, you'll want to immediately isolate the tapes from others. When one of our members found this unfortunate soul you see on the slide, it was quickly sealed in a plastic bag with desiccant packets to keep it as dry as possible. Preventative care is the best way to ward off mold by keeping your tapes in a clean, dry, cool environment. If you still want to transfer a tape that is suffering from mold, we recommend contacting a media transfer vendor to talk about your options. All right, Chris.
So now we're just going to talk about some basics of what is a tape, how are tapes made, and so that we can understand how tapes fall apart and how we can diagnose and try to resolve any problem. So here is the anatomy of a tape. If you've ever been to any kind of webinar about tape preservation, you may have seen a very similar graphic. In the middle, you've got the substrate, the teal part. It's a highly stable PET ribbon. It's resistant to tearing, and it lasts a really long time. That's not the part of the tape that we're worried about. The part of the tape that we're really worried about is the top burgundy layer, called the binder layer. You can see that there's a lot of different parts. There's a lot of stuff inside the binder. So the burgundy part is basically glue. It's adhesive. The little pink specks are magnetic particles. That's where the information is recorded for the video. And then the yellow parts are lubricant reservoirs that make it easier for the tape to roll back through the pinch rollers during playback in the machine. The little blue part on the bottom is an optional back coating that doesn't exist in all tapes, and we're not worried about it. So this is the basic structure of magnetic tape. That includes videotape, audio tape, and data tape. So whatever you're dealing with, whatever kind of format you're dealing with, it's going to look pretty much like this. Before I move on from here, I'll talk about why we're worried about the binder layer. Basically, it's something called sticky shed syndrome. It's something that affects all magnetic tape formats. It's what we call the inherent vice of magnetic media. Basically, that glue falls apart over time. It becomes dehydrated, just like a glue in a book binding. It will fall apart, but unlike a book, when the binding falls apart in a book, you need to reglue it. You take all the pages out, you sew them back together, you put glue on them again. For a tape, it would be as if each individual letter was glued onto a page, and you had little letters just falling apart over time. So as the glue dries out, it doesn't hold the magnetic particles in place as well, and they start falling apart, or they start flaking off entirely. But before they start flaking off entirely, they'll start smearing, they'll start wiggling around, and that is the cause of a lot of different problems. And before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about the structure. So this is the anatomy of a tape from a different view. In the middle of the tape, most of a videotape is going to, unsurprisingly, take up video information. That's the middle bar you can see there. On the edges of it are the audio. And on the very edges of the tape are cue track, control track, index tracks. These are things like metadata. So things that tell the CRT monitor, like how wide the image is, how many frames per second it is, things that keep it in sync with the audio. Here is yet another view, although this is more what a tape looks like when it's going through a playback deck. What a tape player is trying to do is it's trying to recreate roughly a 480p video. That's the equivalent resolution that you might find on YouTube. Not by like reading digital bits, zeros and ones, on a solid state drive or hard drive that goes into a software program and then spits out this really clean looking video. Instead, it's trying to put a tape through this machine that has a cylinder drum in the middle that's spinning at 1800 rotations per minute in order to read what we just saw in the last slide, this diagonal pattern of magnetic particles. I describe it like this. I'm struggling to describe it like this because it's not a set of instructions from a file. It's more like a sewing machine or cuckoo clock. It's not really a computer. It's more of it's important to understand that it's a mechanical process to play this video. So symptoms. What happens when a tape goes through a sticky shed syndrome, starts flaking off? What does that look like visually? How can we tell that that's what the issue is? Or if there's a problem with the ribbon going through this playback machine, how can we tell that that's the issue? Something that makes it really difficult, I think, to talk about this issue is that so much of the information is anecdotal. It's something that you learn by doing and just seeing lots of examples over and over again. But audiovisual archivists have put together a Wikipedia-like guide to common AV artifacts. This is the Audiovisual Artifact Atlas. I highly encourage you to look at this after this presentation is over it's actually pretty fun to just go through and look at different examples of different kinds of artifacts that show up. So let's look at a couple right now. So this is something called skew error. If you look at the top of this image, you see that the image is bent off to the side. So what's happening is that the tape, the physical tape, that ribbon, it's either permanently expanded or contracted over time. One way that can happen is if you have a tape that's in poor storage conditions, it's maybe hotter or more humid than what Anna described earlier, or say not just that it's hotter or more humid, but that it's inconsistent and it keeps shifting. When that happens, the tape will expand and contract repeatedly. This might happen in summer or winter if there's big fluctuations in the environment that the tapes are being stored in. And as that happens over and over again, over maybe 2 or 3 decades of time, the tape loses its elasticity. It's not able to shrink or expand back to its original shape anymore. But that shape and the width of that tape, of the shape of that ribbon, that physical ribbon that's going through the machine, is very exact. It needs to be exactly that size in order to run flush with the video head and be read appropriately. If it's a little bit too big, if it's a little bit too wide, or it's a little bit too narrow, it'll have this kind of problem. There are some things that some tape players can do to mitigate it. There's some skew control, and that can do a lot. But if the tape is expanded or contracted so much, there's a limit to what it can do. So that's one kind of error that will show up. And this is an error that you can't really fix. You can prevent it, but you can't fix it. So dropout, this is something that maybe people have heard about before or they've seen pretty frequently. Dropout is just a result of a defect on a tape. It could be a scratch. It could be a crinkling. For whatever reason, there's a piece of the tape that's not being read by the video head. If you look really closely at this line, it kind of just looks like static. That's because there's just no discernible information. The machine can't read this line of information. It always appears as horizontal bands of white or static, depending on whether it's a scratch to the tape itself or maybe just some debris that's getting into the video head or is on the tape itself. It can be cleaned off. If it's a scratch, there's not really anything that you can do, but it can be prevented with proper tape storage, proper tape maintenance, and machine maintenance too. So this is a video head clog. This is kind of like what I just talked about with dropout. A dropout can be the result of a little bit of debris on the tape. A video head clog would be if like a lot of debris got stuck in the video head of the tape player. So instead of just being a line of lost information, the information is almost getting smeared across the image. You can see in this image here. It's also something that's usually consistent. It's not going to just be on one frame. If some debris comes off of a tape, gets stuck in the video head, then there will be this video head clog across the tape until that debris gets loosened out of the video head. It's usually pretty easily fixed if you can take the tape out, open up the tape player, like we just showed in that video, and you just clean it off carefully. And this is just prevented with regular machine cleaning. So far, the video errors that we've talked about are errors that will result from poor maintenance on the machines or damaged tapes, something that's happened long after recording. This is an example of an error that is baked into the recording. So as an archivist, you're not going to be able to do anything about this. But it's important to know, when there are errors that show up, you can do something about, and when there are errors that show up that you can't do anything about. So this is called a luminance bloom. Basically, the light settings on the camera were not set right for the amount of light this lamp is putting off. Usually, if you have a bright light source, you'll still be able to see details. You'll still be able to see gradations in that light. The light coming from this lamp combined with the levels set on the camera are so off that there's no detail at all. The light is just so overwhelming that it's the maximum light that it can be. So this is something that you as an archivist, like I said, you can't fix. It's something that can be prevented only by the camera operators when they're recording. It's important to notice when you can't do something to fix that. Tracking error. This is a really easy one to fix because it's technically not an error. But I've absolutely had people who saw a tracking error, thought that it was dropout. It definitely looks similar, but it's not. If you grew up with VCRs, if you were a kid and played around with buttons, you didn't know what they meant. You might remember some tracking adjustment buttons, and maybe you just pressed on them while you were watching a tape, and this sort of sparkly band showed up, and it sort of just sparkled, and it wasn't a consistent image. It just sparkled in this band across the image. That's the tracking on the tape. So basically, the tracking is something that helps to establish where the frame is on the tape for the player, but you also have tracking adjustments on the camera that's recording it or the machine that's making a copy of the tape in the first place. And sometimes those tracking settings won't match between the machine that originally created the tape and the machine that the tape is being played on. So if you see something like this, the solution could be as simple as just adjusting the tracking on your VCR, your tape player, and that will resolve it. If you don't, you might end up capturing this tracking error into the digital file that you're creating from the tape. That's something that's very easily preventable. So we're going to watch a few videos of tape damage. Anna and I are going to talk about them a little bit.
So now we're going to play a game called What's Your Damage? And so I'm going to play a clip and we'll have a little look-see, and then we'll think about what could possibly be going wrong here. Here's the first one. So, Chris, tell us, what is our damage?
Can we play this tape on mute?
Yes.
So as this tape is going through, there's all this sort of sparkly stuff at first. You might think, well, we just talked about how that could be a tracking error. But all the sparkly stuff is pretty inconsistent. If it was a tracking error, it would just be the central thing. The image itself wouldn't be bugging out. The sparkles would just sort of be laid on top. So I don't think it's a tracking error. We talked about dropout. So maybe this looks like dropout. It looks like there's some bending. So there's some other stuff going on. Maybe that bending is skew error. But if it was from skew error, the bend would be pretty consistent. It's not. It's only showing up at seemingly like random ways. So I don't think that it's skew error. I don't think that it's dropout either. I think that it's sticky shit syndrome. That was something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. When the binder fails and dries out, it starts to flake off during playback. When that happens, the gunk, this sort of sticky shedded glue, it starts to stick to the inside of the mechanism of the machine. And remember, I talked about, think about it more like a sewing machine. If you have a sewing machine that's struggling to pull through the thread, that's sort of what is happening to this video right now. That bending and tugging, I believe, is a result of the machine struggling to keep the tape flush at the correct tension, at the right speed going through, because there's this sticky shed syndrome. And this is something that I think can be resolved through tape baking, but we'll get to that.
All right, here's the next clip.
And the music becomes a business, is that it, the culture of it sometimes is lost. And that's what I think has been happening with some of what we see now, the MC Hammers and the Vanilla Ices, who sell a lot of records, and it just becomes a money-making venture to the music business. And that kind of scares me because, 20 years from now, you'll just hear about MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice, and you won't hear about artists like that were, the original rappers.
What do you think, Chris?
So I think that, if we can play it again.
Yeah.
So this doesn't really look like any of the things that we talked about earlier. It doesn't look like there's it doesn't look like a video head clog. There's no smearing on it. It doesn't look like dropout. I guess it sort of looks a little bit like a skew, as if there's some kind of bends going on, but it's not at the top of the tape of the image. But because of this like wobbly shape, I think that that's a result of tape deformation. Maybe the tape inside the cassette was pressed down on a part of the tape pack. And so only parts of the tape have been squished. And again, like, think about it like it's not a file. It's the physical object moving through a machine. If it's not quite flush, it's with the video head drum. If it's not able to meet those specifications, then it's going to have some weird effects. And I think that if there's a bend or some crushing going on, then I think that that's what's resulting in this weird, inconsistent wobbly image. It could also be water damage. Water damage could be causing this kind of like ripple in the physical tape itself. I don't think that there would be anything you could do unless maybe tape baking might help a little bit. But I think that you're pretty much stuck with this.
But have no fear. I actually was able to correct this tape baking, which we'll talk about later.
How is Yoruba religion portrayed by commercial media? It's negative. Basically, you take the believers, you take the rainbow, the serpent and the rainbow. These two pictures keep reinforcing that anything outside of Christianity, Catholicism, is bad. It's negative. It's evil.
Okay, what do we got?
So this one is a lot harder. At the very beginning, when the light kind of like increases and decreases over and over again, it seems like that could be the studio lights is changing. It could just be that. It could also be a voltage problem. Like maybe there's if there's not enough voltage in your system, if you're splitting your signal, then there might not be enough voltage to get the right level of brightness that was recorded in the tape. But it could also just be an in-studio light thing. Later on, where it's not just that like the amount of light in the image is flickering in and out, but the entire image is sort of dropping. This makes me think that no, it's not a voltage issue, especially with like the way in which the image is smearing at the bottom. That makes me think that that this is a problem with the tape deck, again, not being able to hold the tape flush with the video head drum. It could be because of sticky shed syndrome, but there's no dropout. There's no like warping like with skew error or tape deformation like we just saw in the last one. So this one is honestly pretty hard. There could be a couple of different things.
It's too late now. I'd like to pronounce on the fate of American cities, or rather world cities, in that, of course, they are perishing, but the demise contains the seeds of the future. The future being not these structures as they're about to collapse in these perishable mortal forms, these individuals trotting about like, well, comic characters perhaps, but rather as those portable, porta-pack, transportable, plasticine, containerized, plug-in, pull-out, add-on modules of a megastructural motel cities. And City Model A and City Model B are both insubstantial and qualified for in the future city, which would be simply addition of, if you have the camera focus on this image, please.
Okay, so this one is a little tricky. What are you seeing?
Something that I think people might be looking at is at the bottom here, there looks like something that kind of looks like a skew error. It definitely seems consistent. It looks like it's kind of, well, it's hard to tell whether this is like black and white because of the tape or because of an error. But yeah, it looks like it could be skew error. But actually, at the bottom there is something called a head switching noise. And it's not a video error. It's the result of the video head not switching quite fast enough as the tape is going through the playback device. The video head is supposed to switch on and off as it samples. That's a little bit of a simplification, but it's supposed to switch on and off. It's not quite switching on and off fast enough, but this would have been outside of the safe signal or the safe zone for TV broadcast anyway. So it wouldn't have been seen in the original. But otherwise, I mean, basically, there isn't anything wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just how the tape was recorded.
Yes, and we love Potato Wolf because they love to experiment with different kinds of video making. A lot of these tapes were mixed live for public access TV. The sound goes in and out. The video is, blurry, and it's just experimental and fun. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing at all. So now that we know how to identify tape issues, we'd like to focus on an option for treatment for possibly the most common issue, sticky shed syndrome. A little more than a year ago, Chris showed up at my house with a big IKEA bag The rack we built for Metro's previous location in Hell's Kitchen had just moved to my home in Brooklyn for temporary storage. So when I saw this big bag, I thought, oh no, more stuff. He said it was a food dehydrator that I could use to bake tapes. I said, sure, whatever, and shoved it in a closet. With the help of XFR Collective members, I rebuilt the rack to its former glory and started transferring tapes again. I came across more and more tapes that had damage similar to those clips we just watched. So I would set them aside and try not to think about them. In January, we started a new partnership with the Urban Video Project to transfer 6 tapes. From 1985 to 2000, this program taught students at the Forsyth Street Satellite Academy, located on the Lower East Side, to make video documentaries exploring the legacies of the African diaspora in New York City. A few moments ago, we watched 2 clips from this collection. During our first transfer night, none of the tapes we tried to play in the U-matic deck would play correctly. Either the machine would stop and give us an error message, or the image looked warped or staticky. It might be important to note that the tapes were all Ampex stock, which has a particularly bad reputation when it comes to sticky shed syndrome. It was clear that the tapes needed baking, but it's not like you can just throw the tapes in an oven for 24 to 48 hours. Re-enter from stage left the Nesco Garden Master, food dehydrator, jerky maker, and for our purposes, tape baker. The machine is super simple. The top sends heat down into a container of loosely stacked plastic trays. The first thing I needed to do was punch out those trays. This is super simple to do by gently hitting the tray with a hammer at the spot where it joins the outer ring. As you can see in the image on the right, I kept the bottom tray intact because I wasn't sure how close the tapes needed to be from the heat source. Once the empty rings are all stacked on top of each other, I can fit 2 tapes in the machine, which lay on their long edge and lean off to the side. Since the trays are loose, it's possible to buy extra trays to give the food dehydrator a little more height, or I could probably also pop out that bottom tray and stand the tapes upright on their long edge. If I did this, I might be able to bake 4 at a time. However, for my work-life balance, transferring 2 tapes in one evening is plenty of work. I probably wouldn't want to do more than 2 anyway. One important thing about baking tapes is that you want to transfer them in a timely fashion after they're finished baking. I try to transfer them right away before the sticky shed syndrome has a chance to return. Chris, you suggested to me that if I waited longer than a week, I would probably need to bake it again.
Yeah, you should wait about 60 minutes or so for the tapes to cool down a little.
Oh, that's good to know because I wasn't waiting quite that long. So the tapes bake anywhere from 8 to 48 hours at a temperature of 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The machine works on a timer, so once the time selected ends, the machine turns off on its own. I was waiting 20 minutes, but now I'll wait 60 minutes for the tape to completely cool before trying to play it. The first time I tried doing this, I used a tape that had already been transferred to make sure it wouldn't melt, and it didn't. So I moved on to the Urban Video Project tapes. By default, I've tried to bake tapes for at least 24 hours and then check to see if it plays. If it does, I try to transfer it. If it doesn't play or there are still parts of the recording that look wonky, then I'll put it back in the dehydrator for another 24 hours. So the transformation I saw with the food dehydrator method was incredible. The tape went from maybe not playing at all, or when it did, looking like static, to after baking, looking like it had just been recorded. So now I'm going to show a clip from the Urban Video Project. This is a longer version of a clip we've already seen. One side shows the tape after 24 hours baking, and the other side shows the tape after 24 more hours baking. So 48 hours total. I wanted to show a longer version of this clip for context to better understand why they included the scene from the 1987 film, The Believers. But it also shows just how dramatic the change is.
Religion portrayed by commercial media. It's negative. Basically, you take the believers, you take the rainbow, the serpent and the rainbow. These 2 pictures keep reinforcing that anything outside of Christianity, Catholicism, is bad. It's negative. It's evil.
In Hollywood, you see, people with strange eyes, and the music changes. All of a sudden, it becomes weird instead of becoming, the rhythms that you hear. So that all of that surrounds it is made weird.
The media seems to be fascinated with only one aspect of Santeria, the fact that Santeria uses animal sacrifice, which is extremely sad. And very bad for the religion and the people at large, because there is much more to Santeria than animal sacrifice.
So, Chris, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts that you wanted to share, seeing the side-by-side comparison.
This is the clip that I had the most trouble with. Because usually when I think about sticky shed syndrome, I think about that first clip that we showed that had a whole bunch of static, because sticky shed syndrome is really supposed to be like magnetic particles are falling off, and that results in this loss of data. But sticky shed syndrome also, you can get to a tape that has sticky shed syndrome before there's like a lot of loss of those magnetic particles, but it's still, I guess the glue is, I'm trying to think about it. I'm trying to think what is physically going on in the machine that's making this happen. It makes me think that, okay, magnetic particles are not falling off yet, but the glue is still like catching onto some of the mechanisms of the tape. And so it's sort of skipping over the video head. Yeah, it looks perfect. It looks like all the problems were resolved.
Yeah, I also wonder if we adjusted more the controls on the time-based corrector, because the image looks so much more bright and colorful on the 48-hour side. All right. So if you're interested in watching the full version of this video or others from the Urban Video Project, they will be on the Internet Archive, but I'm not sure when exactly. We'll probably say something on social media. So please follow XFR Collective on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. So I would suggest that the main takeaway is that when some strange illness has stricken your tape, we recommend that your first course of action is to clean your machine. And then if the problem persists and you have a food dehydrator lying around, try baking. Any other takeaways, Chris?
Check out that website, the Audiovisual Artifact Atlas, because that's also a great way to not only look up examples, but you can also find there's a community of people. There's also a community of people who are uploading those kinds of things, and they're very eager to engage with anyone else who's interested in trying to understand and solve AV artifacts.